welcome. As I think you do all know, actually, I'm Leslie Fitton. I'm the Honorary Secretary of the Hellenic Society, all the hard work being done by Fiona Hara, standing at the back of the room, who is the real secretary and who keeps things running. I won't go over again what the Hellenic Society is or does, because you have all heard that last week, and I think those of you who want to join have joined, and you know, I will not say another word on that topic. But what I will say is that it's great to welcome you all, and of course it's absolutely lovely to welcome back Lindy Crewe, Dr. Lindy Crewe, our guest speaker for this series of lectures, who was here exactly this time last week, again, as many of you know, to give the first lecture in the series. And since then, she's been on a whirlwind tour of the UK. Since we last saw her, she's lectured in Nottingham, in Belfast, and in Cambridge, and is now back in London to do the final lecture of this series. And we're so grateful to her for taking it on. It really is a lot of work. She does it with great good grace and shows no sign of strain, but we know and appreciate the effort that it takes. The lectures are called the Green Lectures because they're named after Professor J.R. Green, Dick Green, who for many years was an absolute doyen of the London classics scene, not least because he coordinated the Ancient Theatre project here in this building in the Institute of Classical Studies. He's now moved back to his native Australia, so he's not able to see his lectures in person, but we hope he's catching up with them online, and we'll certainly be sending him a hugely enthusiastic report about them all. Anyway, Professor Green kindly gave us money to support a lecture series which we hold every 2 years, and particularly the idea was that we could invite speakers from overseas who we wouldn't otherwise perhaps be able to. So, of course, we're hugely grateful to him for his generosity in making that contribution. Completely coincidentally, Lindy is herself from Australia originally, but we haven't had to import her from quite so far away to give this lecture series. Actually, she joins us from Cyprus. And in Cyprus, she is the director of the Cyprus American Archaeological Research Institute in Nicosia. She was educated at first in Australia, then took her doctorate at Edinburgh University under the supervision of Professor Eddie Peltenberg. And then for a glorious year, she worked in the British Museum, which is when I got to know her as curator of the ancient Cyprus collections, working very particularly on the material from the old excavations at the site of Enkami, the very important Bronze Age settlement in the island. And so the online catalogue entries still bear all the hallmarks of the hard work she did during that year. And the year after she left the BM, she published a book on Enkami, and that's just one of her many publications, which I won't even begin to attempt to list here. After that, she went to Manchester University, and I think her students there were lucky for a variety of different reasons to be taught by Lindy, not least because she's always been a keen fieldwork archaeologist and excavator in Cyprus. So some of her students had the opportunity to go out to help with her digging seasons there. We heard a bit last week about her work at Kisonogaskalia, and I'm sure that tonight's talk will also be informed by a lot of her excavation-based research, as well as, of course, there's a whole range of wider research on the early Bronze Age in Cyprus. So I won't say anything more, but I will read the title of the lecture so I get it right. It's my great pleasure to invite her to speak to us on easing gently into the Bronze Age, the case for a connected Chalcolithic Cyprus at the transition from the 4th to the 3rd millennia BC. Thank you, Lindy.
Thank you again to the Hellenic Society for bringing me out here to do these lectures, and of course to Dick Green for sponsoring the lecture series. So it is a long title and it is a complex topic that we're talking about today, but I will do my best to make it both clear and somehow relevant to people who don't know what kinds of problems we have understanding prehistoric Cyprus. And Leslie mentioned the Cyprus American Archaeological Research Institute, and I believe most people also heard about this last week, but our lovely listed residence in Nicosia with accommodation for researchers and our excellent library facilities. So if there are any students here who didn't hear about it, please do take a look at our website, and fellowships are open, closing December for junior fellowships and January for senior fellowships. So please do take a look. So back to our topic for the evening. So Cyprus is often left out of the big stories around the Eastern Mediterranean world, primarily because we're held to be small-scale societies living in isolation and not connected to the Mediterranean region. But that's because the narratives are usually around sort of early urbanism and the big-scale societies and movements of people. So perhaps to think about how Cyprus might be involved in these stories, it might be more fruitful to look at mobile, smaller-scale societies. And we have this key transition date around about 3000 BC that I am going to explore today between the Middle and the Late Chalcolithic. And the problem, one of the problems, you'll see there are many problems, is that the Middle Chalcolithic and the Late Chalcolithic look quite similar in terms of material culture and lifeways. But there are some significant differences, but they sort of hold together as a unit, making the actual transition to the Bronze Age look like a much more radical change than perhaps it really is. So how were interactions with strangers mediated if we're looking to think about a connected Mediterranean at this time? And clearly it's going to be through the development of a corpus of shared symbols and behaviors, particularly perhaps around eating and drinking alcoholic beverages, a favorite topic. So it's not all resolved. There's a lot of objects and types of material culture that are very generic and are not really going to take our understanding forward at this time, but just to highlight some of the areas where we might start to see answers. And I'm very sorry to do this, but we are doing chronologies. Particularly, we know new radiocarbon dates from the excavations at Susciu, to be compared with the earlier 80s and 90s excavations at Caslomiga Mosfilia and Lemba Lacus. So we're starting to get a little bit more information. And then we have a very exciting deposit that I'm going to show you from another site under excavation, Chlorchas Paluras. And when we get to this Filiar period, which is this blurry kind of phase that sits overlapping the late Chalcolithic but preceding the early Bronze Age proper, we don't have many dates at all. We think around about 2500 BC, but we know that it overlaps with the late Chalcolithic to an unknown extent. And then by about 2250, we start the early Cypriot Bronze Age. And then we have some dates where that continues, but again, this is available evidence. We don't have a great deal of evidence. I'm bringing in Tarsus to this story because Tarsus in southwestern Anatolia is the site that is most often used to tie in links to Cyprus. There are a few Cypriot imports there, but their chronologies are also quite problematic. But what does help us is a recent synchronization of the early bronze dates between the northern and the southern Levant, and that has sort of enabled us to start talking about this whole region in a more connected manner. So what do we know about Chalcolithic and early Bronze Age settlement on Cyprus? Not very much is the answer. You can see here a range of Middle Chalcolithic sites, and you'll notice that they are all down in that southwestern region. Up here, we really don't have much evidence at all. Some test trenches at Kira, at Filiar, and we really have a larger focus on early Bronze Age cemeteries in the northern areas of the island. This green line in black is indicating where, since 50 years ago, 1974, there has been no archaeology able to be undertaken in the northern and eastern parts of the island because it's still contested territory after the Turkish invasion and coup, and we abide by UNESCO conventions that say no archaeology in war zones and contested territories. So given that those areas are much closer to the mainland, both to Levant and to Anatolia, that's where we might expect to see our connections, and we do not. So we have this evidence mainly from the southwest, although Magunda is another site that's just recently excavated. And we know that the heartland of this transition to the early bronze, the filial, is located up there on the north coast and in the northwest. So we move forward with the information we have, and particularly important to note the yellow ring, the pillow lavas, the location of the copper sources ringing the central Troodos mountain range. This is becoming key at this time because around about 3000 BC, we start to see the first indigenous exploration and use of cold hammering of Cypriot copper sources, and by the filial, we're seeing exploitation of the indigenous sources. So I thought long and hard about how we can tell this story in the most accessible way, and it means we have to start with what is this filial? What does it look like, and how is it different from the Chalcolithic? Then I'm going to move back to the Middle Chalcolithic period, and then I'm going to come out from Cyprus and talk about the early Transcaucasian phenomenon. This phenomenon that we will see goes all the way from the Caucasus, moving down through parts of Anatolia and into the northern Levant and southern Levant. And then I'm coming back to Cyprus for the late Chalcolithic. And then finally, I will come to my excavation at Chrysonoga and see how we might be able to inform on some of these problems. So the filial is absolutely and utterly a clear material culture horizon. These really beautiful jugs with cutaway spouts, shiny red polished surface, sometimes incised geometric decoration filled with lime paste, and characteristic pendants on Cyprus called spurred annular pendants. So we start with a quote from Porphyrios Dikios to sort of see how this has been interpreted. This is from 1962. The withdrawal of the traditional characteristics began in Chalcolithic II. Here read what we now call the late Chalcolithic, when the red and black pottery, probably to be connected with the Kerbet-Kerekware movement, read early Transcaucasian phenomenon, invades Cyprus and tends to out the Chalcolithic I, Middle Chalcolithic, painted ware. But the local element survived in force since the shapes of the vases continued on traditional lines. In the early Cypriot I, this is the filial, the new Western Anatolian strain was so powerful that little of the traditional culture survived, and even that soon merged into the overwhelming strain of the newcomers. So it's a dramatic battle between pottery styles, but in the end, Dikios, as ever, got the narrative pretty much correct. Porphyrios Dikios, one of the greatest Cypriot prehistoric archaeologists to ever work. So what is the filial? It is signalled by a move from living in single-celled roundhouses to multi-roomed rectilinear structures. And this is obviously a very key transformation in a society, going from living as a family unit inside one room with a central hearth, and perhaps your activities are conducted communally outside the roundhouses, sharing spaces and perhaps cooking facilities. And then you move to the rectilinear multi-roomed buildings. Privacy and containment into the sort of extended family unit is increased. You have a compound with a courtyard, several rooms. So it's an increase in ownership and an increase in privacy. And then you can see up in the top photo, Chalcolithic burial is characterized by intramural pit graves, except for one exception that I'm going to show you. And then in the Bronze Age, we see a movement to extramural cemeteries located usually in, so you can see the hills above Marchialonia there, about half a kilometre away, cut into the slopes of these chalk hills, so overlooking the settlement, but from a distance. And we also see settlement shift, so we don't really have any nice stratigraphic sequences going from Chalcolithic to Bronze Age, except maybe with one exception, and we can't really trace these changes so easily. And there's also the Chalcolithics liked to abandon houses with the full repertoire of household goods remaining inside. The Bronze Ages like to clean their floors and take all the usable goods with them when they left. And so for archaeologists, the Chalcolithics are kinder to us. There's new food preparation. We get cooking pots for the first time associated with these, what we call hobs, either freestanding and movable or inbuilt to hearths. But this cooking pot represents the first direct heat boiling vessels, so the first time you can make things like stews and porridges. So again, a pretty radical change in cooking and eating habits. Other transformations include new animals, screwhorn goats, donkeys, so the first time we have beasts of burden. Cattle are reintroduced at this time, again, moving from the hoe agriculture to plough agriculture with the help of oxen, able to clear greater areas of land, all sorts of benefits to having cattle. Woolly sheep, associated perhaps with new ways of producing textiles, and all of the secondary products that are associated with these animals. So these textile technologies, spindle wheels made of terracotta, we'll see that's not that simple. Loom weights are apparently a filière innovation. And this is where we see the first use of indigenous copper for casting weapons and tools, but we also see imported Anatolian and Cycladic coppers and, of course, bronze with tin. We do not have any tin on Cyprus. And new types of personal ornaments, and we'll see why that is important in just a moment. So, the biggest debates around this question of when the filière starts and how did indigenous communities react to it is the length of this timeline. Peltenberg and also Diane Bolger believed that this was the end phase of a continuous long Chalcolithic set of contacts that culminated in the filière at the end of the Chalcolithic. Webb and Frankel, in various articles particularly, believe that it was a faster process happening only at the very end of the late Chalcolithic and brought about by groups of migrants and traders coming to Cyprus at this time. So all of these traits, all of these new things that are occurring, it has been recognized that, for example, donkeys are not in Anatolia at that time. So why are we looking just to Anatolia for these imports? Chamber tombs are not attested there, but they are attested in the Levant. So it's been a bit of a mixed bag, but everyone has kind of thought that the strongest traits are Anatolian, and in many ways they are. But the motivations have also been seen as economic. So this is the time in Anatolia, a little bit later, mid-3rd millennium, that we're seeing the Anatolian trade network. So precocious traders, big networks, moving goods around, and Cyprus is held to be drawn into this because of its copper at this time. And complemented on the Cypriot side by certain aggrandizers in the communities trying to participate in these systems. The other problem is, to us, from our archaeological viewpoint, the filière looks extremely flat. So if it's 300 years, 500 years, we can't see any typological changes or developments through time, and this is obviously unlikely to be the full story. Now, stepping back to the Middle Chalcolithic, and particularly the important settlement of Chrysonegamosfilia, excavated by Eddie Peltenberg in the 80s and 90s. Chrysonegamosfilia, one of the biggest prehistoric sites known on the island, and you can see here a sequence of roundhouses. Grey are the Middle Chalcolithic ones, black the Late Chalcolithic. There are open paved areas between the roundhouses, perhaps communal areas or walkways. This is an example of how a Middle Chalcolithic house looks by showing you the Lemba experimental village in the neighboring village of Lemba. Central hearths in each of the roundhouses, stone foundations, mud pisse upper walls, and roofs made of beams as well as soil and perhaps seaweed and perhaps other elements. And there are a variety of houses, very large ones up to 12 meters, smaller ones just 3 or 4 meters across. So perhaps not every house was for dwelling, but for other purposes as well. But the key material that really characterizes the Middle Chalcolithic and the early Chalcolithic, but it comes to a peak in the Middle Chalcolithic, is the use of picrolite, which is an indigenous soft soapstone kind of material, which gets its blue-green color from the copper. It's also located up in the pillow lavas. It's very easy to carve, and it makes these really lovely little pendants. The center one up the top is in the British Museum, if anyone wants to see one in real life. It's not picrolite, but you can see they're not all made of picrolite. We have examples made in bone, made in shell, but by far the majority are picrolite. They're called cruciform figurines for the reason that their little arms stand out, their legs are foreshortened, and you can perhaps see up here, this more elaborated version is clearly actually crouching, which is why we have these foreshortened legs. Where sex is shown, they are female, but that's certainly not always the case. And we would have to suggest that these very long necks and heads are certainly a phallic element to the figurine. So there's probably a duality of the sexes depicted here. They come in sizes from about 1 centimetre to about 20 centimetres high. Some are pierced for wearing as pendants. Others you could tie a string around the neck to suspend them. Some are questionably anthropomorphic. The top right, you could say, okay, possibly, but is this meant to be an anthropomorph? Not sure. But in any case, these are absolutely the hallmark of the Middle Chalcolithic, found in settlement and in graves, and I'll show you some context for those in a moment. But importantly, the style and the variability is so very great here. Some very skilled examples, some quite rough examples, but it very much looks like perhaps each person had to carve their own, or perhaps you had, some part of the life stages was the time that you carved your picrolite pendant, but there is a whole lot of variability. So this is where we come to Suskew. Suskew, I excavated the cemetery, Eddie Peltenberg excavated the settlement, but it's got a really key location in the landscape between this southwestern Lemba cluster of sites up here and down to Erimi down the bottom, which was another important Middle and Late Chalcolithic site. And it's located between the sea and the mountains for the picrolite and the mountains for the initial exploration of those copper resources. Faience is highlighted there. And in the cemeteries at Suskew, both Suskew Launa and Vathakakis that we'll see, we find faience beads. And they've been analysed to contain traces of tin, so they're certainly imported objects. And they certainly date to before 3000 BC, about 2900 BC, as early as we see them in Egypt and Mesopotamia. But again, these are some of our generic types of objects that it's very hard to pin down to an exact location where they might have come from. So Suskew settlement, located on this very narrow ridge up here next to the Diarizos River, the cemetery, one Laona up there, and ringed by further cemeteries down here. And as far as we know, and this might change, this is the only Chalcolithic settlement with an extramural cemetery or cemeteries. You can get a sense here of how very remote that location is in the landscape. There is no water up there, and this is pre-donkey, so they're having to drag their water up from this very steep ravine. The houses are now quite sort of eroded off the sides of the slopes, but it's quite an extensive settlement. And here we start to see cold hammered copper objects, this spiral pendant, and one of our cruciforms with double arms that's been blackened by fire. The cemetery, located in a very prominent position, sort of at the road that leads into the settlement, so you would have had to pass the cemetery to get to the settlement. We had over 150 mortuary features cut into this limestone bedrock. Here you can see a typical Middle Chalcolithic shaft grave with this round capstone cut. They would have put a big limestone slab to seal the tomb between interments because they are multiple interment tombs. The latest interment lay out on its side in a sort of flexed position, and earlier burials were shoved to the northern end of the tomb and the long bones arranged in piles and the skulls stacked on top. So it's a very specific burial arrangement. And a few images of human remains to follow if anyone is worried by that. So this burial here, this articulated individual, was found very nicely with one of the picrolites in the chest cavity, so for sure we can say that that person was buried wearing one of these around their neck. We come to another more complex tomb here, where it looked like maybe you've got 2 or 3 individuals buried at the base of this large circular shaft. No picrolites in this tomb, only these 2 red and white painted bowls. So there is no real set program of grave goods at this time. It is quite variable. And when our physical anthropologist, Kirsty Lorenz, analysed these mortuary remains, she found that in fact it's 4 people of various ages and sexes, and they've been arranged into groups of bones that are more or less anatomically what each body would need, but these bones do not belong all to the one body. So there's been a lot of rearrangement going on here. And we have these grave goods that are just apparently generic within the tomb. Interestingly, we have a lot of chipstone tools and a lot of debitage from making chipstone tools. So it really looks like there were processing these bodies and perhaps cutting ligaments and tendons, etc., by making the tool in or over the tomb and then discarding the tools in the tomb. Presumably they were considered unclean or something like this. But the complexity of the programs at this cemetery very much looks like we're starting to see mortuary specialists. So perhaps these are the people in the communities who were becoming sort of like bigging themselves up by having these extra skill set and perhaps being able to acquire more in the community through these skills. We also have a lot of smaller pit features that have no bodies, but that do have grave goods. So it looks like in addition to inhuming remains, we're also having a situation of commemorative rituals, objects deposited in pits adjacent to the tombs. And again, pots or picrolites or both, a mixture, and some with nothing. One at the top here has faience. So we are seeing increased deposition of eating and drinking vessels. On Cyprus, we never have plates, we always have cups, both for eating and drinking. But these are elaborate goblets here, so it looks like there's an increased importance perhaps in consuming, again, probably liquids to do with mortuary rituals. So Susku Laona Cemetery goes out of use first. Susku Vathakakis across the ravine remains in use until the end of the Middle Chalcolithic. And this is where it starts to get a lot more elaborated. This is a 2.5 meter deep pit that has been dug into the chalk stone with an awful lot of effort. We had to get an earth mover to remove the capstone there. And we have a few grave goods in here, again, chipstones. But this tomb is so elaborate in its construction process that it's unlikely to have just been one family digging a family crypt. It's more likely that they were co-opting labor and resources in from other sectors of the community. Vathakakis is also abandoned, but before it is, we see a really interesting phenomenon in amongst the personal ornaments. The picrolites at the Susku Laona Cemetery have use-wear, and we can tell that they were used and worn in life and then deposited in death. At Vathakakis, the cruciforms and these other new forms do not have use-wear, so it seems we can see a shift from these symbols being important in life to only being important in death. And we get new types, and Eddie called this very coyly the bar and disc pendant, but you might want to call it something else. And then we have these V-shaped pendants. Again, these absolutely, we can't explain it, but there's final Neolithic Greek parallels. There's parallels in the Amuk. Whenever we see these new exotic shapes, we also see them deposited with other exotics, such as faience. So the cemetery is abandoned, the settlement remains occupied, and then we see a return to the more regular Chalcolithic practice of intramural burial in the houses. So, another hint of seeing perhaps the cessation of certain ritual behaviours at the Middle Chalcolithic comes from the ceremonial area at Kasonga, located at the end of this pathway. A bowl was found deposited in a pit with over 30 objects of mainly figurines, a triton shell. Figurines are all pottery and stone. None of them are made of picrolite, but it was found in this sort of ash-filled stony pit. It was excavated down. You can see here this array of material that was pulled out of it, and including these figurines, which are, again, these are sort of indicating childbirth, and that seems to have been a preoccupation with the Chalcolithics as well. Should have mentioned the picrolites. The cruciform pose is held to be a woman standing up to give birth, which is common in many cultures, and perhaps seated on a birthing stool or just standing and crouching. And this figurine is also nicely wearing an example of itself. This is a vessel, but that expression of anguish is held to also be an expression of pain of childbirth. We have other examples of that. The bowl itself was covered in white clay to obscure the painting on the decoration, and once it was cleaned up, it's clearly a model of a roundhouse. You can see the central half, you can see these ridges at the side there, the door even has a little pivot stone for the doorpost, and this maps closely onto what we see in terms of Middle Chalcolithic occupation areas. This seems to have been cooking, food and storage, tool storage behind the door. This is a pattern that's repeated in Middle Chalcolithic house use. So this whole set of figurines and objects and this very special vessel were basically decommissioned and buried in a pit at the end of the Middle Chalcolithic at Kasoniga. So, coming back to our red shiny pottery that we're focusing on here today, so-called red and black burnished ware. This is an array of vessels that we can see from the Paphos Museum, from a variety of sites, very elaborated pouring vessels with these elaborated pouring spouts. Again, we have our small individual bowls and a lovely storage jar there. So these are very hard, very shiny, and a great contrast to that earlier red and white painted pottery we were seeing. The red and white ware just used local clay, quite cruddy, thick-walled, simple shapes because it wasn't very good clay. To make these, they have to go at least 5 kilometers from the settlement up into the foothills of the Troodos again to source iron-rich clays which have greater plastic properties. And these walls of these vessels are like 2 millimeters thick. You flick the vessel and it makes a ping. These are absolutely metallicizing types of pots. Now we come to the outside world and see what might be going on out there that might have caused some of these transformations. The Kerbet-Kerek-Kuro-Araxes early Transcaucasian phenomenon starts in the Caucasus around 4000 BC. There is a lot of variability in what these small groups are doing, but the pottery across all sites is red and black or black or grey or brown, but shiny and handmade, and there's a high investment in surface treatment. And it's small bowls and large jars, and it's held to be drinking vessels again, either wine or beer. These people are making metal artifacts, but it's not a great deal, and the pottery is metallicizing. And then we start to see the movements of these traits, which are going around Anatolia and the Levantine area, and they're moving to the Amuk, to the southern Levant, and also eastern Anatolia. This is just 2 examples of the kinds of variability that's going on with these ETC communities and groups. Southern Levant, they have this shiny red pottery, and they have local types. They also have cattle, they have hobs, such as we have, and they do not have cooking pots. They bring these goods, they make these goods there, but they use local southern Levantine cooking pots. At Aslan Tepe in central Anatolia, we have again this red, shiny, metallicizing pottery, along with some other types. They do not have hobs. They have sheep, goat, no cattle, and they use the local traditional halves. There are many more examples of how variable these groups are. This is a very nice map done by Toby Wilkinson, where you can see the spread through time of these groups, starting up in the Caucasus there, coming along, moving down to almost the Cilician area of the Amuk, and then we see around 3100, they're coming down through here in the Amuk, barely, not really in Cilicia at all. Around Ras Shamra is another coastal area, and then there's a gap, and then we're down in the southern Levant. So the gap, Graham Phillip believed that it could be because they're seafaring between the northern Levant and the southern Levant, and that makes it a bit easier to see Cyprus coming into play because we are obviously very close, 60 kilometers from Ras Shamra to the point of Cyprus. It could also be because that gap is pretty much Lebanon and maybe enough work has not been done in there as yet. Toby put Cyprus into the picture at the last stage, and that's the Anatolian Trade Network stage, but I think we should be taking it back to this point when we can see all these different connections happening. Because by the time we get to that green area across there where everyone's interconnected, that is a much different society, and a lot of the traits of these earlier groups up here have already been adapted and absorbed into Anatolian material culture. Focusing in a little bit onto these areas here, there are debates whether these people are nomads. It's agreed that they're agropastoralists with some degrees of mobility. They do have strong regional differences, not only in houses, but in burial practices, but they all seem to be very focused on the home and hearth. And the expansion is attributed to seeking metal-rich landscapes but avoiding urban areas. And one theory has been that they are winemakers. So they're moving into sort of more marginal landscapes, perhaps upland areas where they can cultivate vines, and they're not in conflict for the groups who are already in these places who might be cultivating crops and harvesting. So they can move in, they are doing it without economic competition, and perhaps they're bringing something that they can offer that is desirable to these indigenous groups. And I like this, they exhibit a propensity to coexist with other cultures. That's all I can tell you for now in this very short lecture, but it's really an interesting phenomenon, the early Transcaucasian. So late Chalcolithic Chthonigomosphilia. This is a middle Chalcolithic house you can see in the open reserved area of the site. In the background is this house under excavation here, known as the Pithos house. And what happens between the middle Chalcolithic and the late Chalcolithic is seemingly a change in architectural techniques. Middle Chalcolithic houses, this one is a bit special. They've brought up sandstone from the coast, half a kilometre up the hill to build these foundations. But it holds that middle Chalcolithic house foundations are generally neater and tidier and more substantial than late Chalcolithic ones, which are quite sort of scrappy and rough with small stones. You can see this beautiful thick plaster floor here in the middle Chalcolithic. They do not make those anymore in the late Chalcolithic. So it's kind of same, but kind of different. And here, an example of a late Chalcolithic house that we reconstructed at Chthonigomosphilia with different things going on. So-called the Pithos house because it was destroyed by fire with over 60 vessels inside, 30 of which were large storage vessels, as well as an array of groundstone tools, needles, and other objects. This is where we come to our change in personal ornaments. Our picrolites have gone, there are no more cruciforms being produced, but we are still using the raw material picrolite to make these spurred annular pendants. And they could also be in shell or bone, and there are the odd copper one also known. But they predate the appearance of northwestern imported filiar material to Chthonigomosphilia. So they are something that is in use from the beginning of the late Chalcolithic. This is again one of our generic types of objects that occurs in the Balkans, the Aegean, and Anatolia in various times and places from the 4th to 2nd millennium. That is pretty well impossible for us to come any closer to pinning this down. Suffice to say that these are a version of ring idols, you can see here and in the bottom row, but does that help us? And the answer is not very much at the moment. The other introduction at Chthonigomosphilia is chamber tombs, but they're intramural, not extramural cemeteries. And this is where we start to see a complex of grave goods that should go with the burial, and that's pottery and the odd personal ornament. You can see one of our new red shiny vessels there at the feet. And this burial is very interesting. It's very similar to tombs of filiar date known from the site of filiar, where you can see this division of the chamber, this low wall. Coming to Lemba Lacus, our other neighbouring site out in the southwest, we have again no filiar material, but some odd things going on in the late Chalcolithic. These wasted stones and groove stones and conical stones, and then we have one seal from Lemba and one seal from Chthoniga, and does 2 seals in the whole Chalcolithic make a sealing system? Probably not. But what are these conical stones and grooved stones? Possibly they're gaming pieces, or possibly they're tokens for some sort of redistribution. And then an artifact that has been made much of is the so-called Lemba face pot. And you can see here, it's local production, our red and black stroke burnished. Eddie Peltenberg had traced that to Anatolian connections of face pots, but in the end, it is much more similar to a Kerbet Kerekware example from Hatzor in the southern Levant. These so-called double spiral motif. It's because this is not really a proper face pot, I think. And to be fair, Eddie, in a later article, did say that this Hatzor example was a good parallel. But everyone has been looking to Anatolia for these connections. And then one more object from Lemba, the Raid disc pendant. And they also have more of these bar and disc, or one more of these bar and disc pendants. It's from a late Chalcolithic context. This is our closest example to a proper ring idol, upright with the piercing at the top instead of flipped the way the Cypriots did it and with the spur at the bottom. Except from Susciu-Launa cemetery, firmly dated to the Middle Chalcolithic, this tantalizing bone, very much an annular pendant. So we might be even taking annular pendants back before the end of the Middle Chalcolithic. So we have a number of innovations that, in fact, are not in this clear horizon of switch to middle to late, that are actually appearing before the end of the Middle Chalcolithic. That's how faience, cold hammered copper objects such as hair spirals here, and in the final phase of occupation at the Launa settlement, we have the deposition of these figurine fragments, metal, and these new types of stone, spherical or flat chalk objects, which Giulia Muti's research has shown can actually be functional spindle whorls. So again, this is a trait, these so-called new textile technologies, we seem to take them back. And we also seem to take back conical stones to the Middle Chalcolithic and the advent of this red and black stroke burnished shiny pottery. Okay, coming to our lovely assemblage from Chloricus Pelurus, which was excavated fairly recently. You can see inside this beautiful jar an assemblage of a copper base axe, which is Anatolian copper with tin inside, so again it's an import, a groundstone axe. And one of the traits of the late Chalcolithic groundstone axes is they change shape, they become longer and flatter and seem to be imitating metal axes, along with these boar's tusk hooks here. But that jar does not look like a typical late Chalcolithic whole mouth jar, the two examples from Lemba and Kisonaga you see here. It very much looks like an example again from Filiar Tomb 1. So this is 2600 BC. I think we can basically say at this point, the Filiar is starting 2600 BC, and we'd probably like to take it back further as well. And then something that has been an absolute revelation that Raphael Lautari and I are working on. He has just done his PhD on Bronze Age pottery, amongst other things. Went back to the Filiar tombs for the first time since they were excavated in the 1940s. And lo and behold, we have Chalcolithic pots in the Filiar tombs. So this is an exciting revelation. So it's a two-way street, basically. It's not the Filiars, Anatolians coming in and telling the Cypriots, this is what you do now. It's basically absolutely firmly crossing over between the two. That's that tomb. So they look a bit different, but these are functionally equivalent. Pouring spout, and absolutely you would certainly, if you were inviting guests around and you were going to pour some liquid out, the elaboration of this pouring action is going to be exactly the same effect with both of these vessels. Individual bowls. But we can trace the annular pendants back to the beginning of the late Chalcolithic. We get northwestern Filiar pottery appearing in the later late Chalcolithic. And then it's in this period 5, the Filiar, where we start to see cows at Kisonaga. So maybe we can start to see a sequence, and maybe there's something we can do about trying to disentangle this and see if we can put some chronology into the typology of all of these vessels. So very briefly now, coming to Kisonaga Scalia. We've been mainly working at the transition from the Middle to the Late Bronze Age, as we saw last week, but there are some areas of the site where we've excavated down to some very nice early exposures. In Area D, we have a lovely Filiar architectural array, which is these very beautifully made rectilinear walls. They're very narrow, only 60 centimeters, and very lovely plaster-built features, which we don't really see so much in the early Bronze Age proper. And this very nice little, it's either a labret for a lip or an ear. Again, it has Aegean, Anatolian parallels. It's unique on Cyprus, and one of our Filiar annular pendants up there. But what we have going on is a really interesting interplay between the local late Chalcolithic potters with their fabrics that were used in the red and black stroke burnished, and imported northwestern Filiar. This is a thing called a neck juglet because it's basically the neck of what would go in a regular sized jug, but instead of putting it on a big vessel, it's sort of sealed off at the bottom and they make it a little juglet. It's only a filial thing. But we have top imported, bottom local, and again, spindle whorls, top imported northwestern filial, bottom local production. So it's absolutely all going on here. In another area of the site, in the center here, we came down onto what seems to be an outdoor area, sadly, of a sequence of filial and then EC1 to 2, where we see nice filial groundstone tools. In the top there, you can see there's 2 of those chalk stone discs that are functional spindle whorls, as well as local production filial and local production early Cypriot. In the northern area of the site here, you can see this curb running down the side is a pure Chalcolithic deposit. They made these little low curbs and we don't know why. And then the pitscape there seems to be filial and EC. And again, we have a really interesting interplay of imported northwestern filial in the bottom center, black slip and coned, another filial ware up there, and then local imitations in local clay, as well as the top white painted filial imported and filial cookpots imported. So it has not helped us so much, Cassonigas Galliard, because it is this really compressed flat chronology that is not behaving at the moment. And there's one site in the center of the island that provides an interesting contrast to the settlements that we've seen, and that's Politico Kokkinerotsas hunting station. And this is located in the foothills of the Troodos. It's just a series of pits and deposits, and it has red and white middle Chalcolithic pottery with red, black, shiny, late Chalcolithic pottery. So this very much looks like it's, and also it has large amounts of deer, so there's definitely hunting and consuming going on here. So if we're imagining those ETC groups did make it to Cyprus, and if we're imagining that they might be going to sort of less occupied areas, then perhaps in this type of hunting station environment, away from settlements, might be where relationships could be built and sort of agreements mediated, and perhaps if the indigenous populations are bringing the deer to the feast and the ETC people are bringing their wine along. So this could be the kind of location that we should perhaps be looking for to think about how these interactions might have happened. So we can see the demise of these middle Chalcolithic symbolic systems and these lifeways in tandem with a whole range of new interactions. So because the information from Suskew is higher resolution, we are able to start seeing these changes. But we need more well-published sites from the mainland, and we also need more information on Cyprus. So these diverse lifeways that the ETC groups seem to demonstrate, they seem to be unified by this shiny red and black pottery and by their focus on the household. So they're not involved in large-scale metal trade. But, so they have different motivations than we see in the later Anatolian trade network movements. So perhaps this explains why we just see these cautious steps into exploring indigenous copper resources with the middle Cal. The quest for picrolite turns into the quest for copper over time. And we are seeing ongoing connections and selective adoptions and selective rejections of various types of material. So when we get to Anatolian Early Bronze Age II proper, when we have the Anatolian trade network, these late Chalcolithic and filial communities already shared common practices around eating and drinking and styles of personal appearance. The textiles, we must always remember, might have been quite elaborate as well. So perhaps the filial is not this sudden conflict. It doesn't need to be a competition between ways of life if we think about it as something that could be much smoother than this violent Bronze Age process. Okay, thank you very much.